Yes. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the R&D Unplugged. This is the 11th R&D Unplugged session that we're having, seminar we're just doing. Today, we are with our very own Marc Santolini. We're very happy to have him tell us all about reinventing wisdom.
Yeah.
Marc.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you online for being here. Actually, online, I shared the link to my slide in the chat, so you can even skip everything I'm going to talk about, or go back to some slides if you want. So today, I made a new talk compared to the past few years, and part of it is a result of some work we did in the past 2 years, maybe, and also some insights from visiting a few, I would say, new education places in Bhutan and Nepal in a little sabbatical I did. So I wanted to give some insights. And the title is a bit derived from 2 books that have been important in my personal journey. And so that's why I put this title of Reinventing. Obviously, nothing is reinvented. It's more like a rehash, but there were books that were about open science communities, citizen science communities, the way we work in crowds to make innovation, and the way crowds can organize in organizations, formal organizations actually, with methods that are more distributed and more networked. And so this talk will kind of bring an aspect that maybe was less investigated in those particular books, that is the aspect of the relational practices, maybe more the individual level practices that are linking to these networks. So that's great, there's a chat. And we have the chat all the time, right? That's great, keep chatting. So I'm going to do a little Learn Planet kind of Institute raison d'être slide, right? So we have, I think many people talk about polycrisis, meta-crisis, meaning crisis, an intersectional number of crises, and in supplementary slides I have a nice network of all these crises. And they involve many perspectives, many disciplines, many stakeholders. And for this reason, the type of practice you need in order to get everyone around the table to talk about that requires good knowledge on how to coordinate really different styles of people and different styles of ways of knowing and of disciplines. So there are whole fields of team science, collective intelligence, crowd science that have emerged in really the past 15 years to look more specifically on that. And there's journals, there's conferences on these topics. And this is something we've tackled in the past, well, now 7 years actually we've been in the LPI. It's so long that it was a free poster actually. And we've been looking at different ways we can measure dynamics in teams and communities, whether it's teams that perform science or just teams of learners that do challenge-based learning, for example. And our way of investigating this phenomena is to look at the networks of interaction, the collaboration networks, the advice networks, and the way information can propagate around, and the way people can help each other to solve certain problems. So an example of that is a community or an ecosystem called iGEM that we're studying. It's a challenge where teams solve problems in synthetic biology. And this is a project that has been funded by the LPI and is now funded by an INR. And an example of the kind of study we do with networks is reconstructing collaboration network across the whole ecosystem, who interacts with Zoom, and then looking at things such as how central a certain node is in the collaboration network, and how does that affect their performance or their success. And we can see things, for example, like something we've shown in that paper here, is that in that investigation, we looked at if you begin at the periphery of the ecosystem, which is low values on these different centralities, then as you participate, it's very hard for you to get in the center. But if you begin a bit more at the center, then you get super, super central. And so there's, for example, in that particular ecosystem, we discovered that there was a social elevator that was broken. And it was actually, if you keep coming at the periphery, you couldn't go in the center, and it was getting more and more critical. So this is something that through looking at these networks and through monitoring and evaluating that, you can understand what type of feedback is useful to change or to intervene in the system. And we have collective intelligence practitioners here that know very well this kind of consulting you can actually give to people. So this showed us that actually these feedback processes of understanding what's going on and being able to change the way the system works can enhance collective decision making. And there's a need to kind of handle these bottom-up processes, this feedback from the ground in order to change the system, which is the whole concept of learning organization. And there's aspects that are difficult because as much as what we're focusing, which is very structural, is something that can be looked at, there's also aspects that are cultural, that are maybe harder to change or different in terms of practices to change. And that's a concept that actually was recognized quite early on in the collective intelligence literature. A famous example is this Google Aristotle project, where 180 teams in Google were looked at, and they couldn't find really that many structural patterns that would explain the success and the performance of teams. But through interviews, they understood that what was important for people was the ability to have a safe container, a safe space of being able to talk to each other truly and to exchange. And this is something that, if you look at the early paper on collective intelligence, was actually a main result, that the collective intelligence is related to the social sensitivity of group members and the equality in the distribution of conversational alternative, as well as the gender diversity of the group. So these were aspects that are, in a way, very much linked to the culture more than the structure. And that's something also that's recognized in a way when you go and discuss with community facilitators in the context of intentional communities, or in general with practitioners of collective intelligence. That there's an aspect related to the ability to sense the group state and to have some form of metacognition. So there's a nice paper on that by Sasha Poquet, who was a fellow here some time ago, and she published a paper on sensemaking last year. There's also a cognitivist, John Verdeker, who worked on this concept of agent-arena relationship. And discussing with practitioners, I often heard terms such as social permaculture, for example, that what they do is something that is about gardening, or that is something about managing tensions, and that this is a felt experience they have at the birth of tensions. And it's something very hard to really measure. It's something that is an art and a report that you often get from them. And that actually is something we're looking at right now in one particular community where we have the chance to have the whole Slack across 2 years. And we have like many projects in that community. And it's very nice because we analyze the content of messages, and we saw across coordinators that some use a very feel language. They actually use that term. How do you feel? How does it feel for you to do that? And others use think language. What do you think we should do? You know? And we saw that there's really, when we looked at the coordinators in one polarity, was very much linked to this role of facilitation and onboarding the community, while others were linked to the implementation or leadership aspect in the community. So there's a bit these two aspects that are in a way linked to governance and to facilitation. And that, I think, brings to that context that we've been exploring more this past year and a half, which is not knowledge itself, but wisdom, and the scientific term of wisdom. So I took many references in the slides. That's what I shared them online. I have 2 pages of reference at the end. But I put a nice one here, which is a book that collects a lot of papers on the scientific study of wisdom. And that is defined as, actually, that is well summarized here, which is the ability to see the perspective from which you see a given truth statement. And wisdom is related to the ability to see that you have a perspective and to change perspective, and to accept that there can be different truth from different perspectives, which I think is also what leads this place to be an interdisciplinary place, because this is, in a way, the birth of how you think in terms of wisdom. And there's known practitioners in cognitive science, not practitioners, sorry, scholars, practitioners, actually, that talk about defining a type of knowing, which is the one we're used to in science, which is propositional, and distinguish it from what they call perspectival knowing. And they use a term for saying how you achieve perspectival knowing, which is a bit complex. They call that recursive relevance realization, which is the ability to step back and see what is it that you're making relevant in your landscape. And so what are the axioms you have, which is very self-inquiry related. That's something that has also a history in feminist philosophy, where standpoint theory and situated knowledges from Donna Haraway have been setting the stage on looking at science in ways of what are ways of knowing and ways of situating yourself in the world that leads you to know in a certain way. And I also cited perspectival realism because we have a paper on that sharing how this is the kind of philosophy important for citizen science. So that's how we kind of began to go towards wisdom. And the interesting thing with wisdom is that this is, there are very old practices that are related to this art of looking at your action and looking at the way you look at things. And they train a meta-observer or witness observer. And they're very different than typical propositional, hypothetical, deductive knowing because they relate to direct experience of phenomena. So I just put here some photos of typically a library when I was touring in India, where you see these old books that are, an inquiry into the nature of the seer and the seeing. And when you look at these books, this is scholar work. This is like a nature protocol of like, here's the steps you do, and then you have access to that. But this is, this is not just stories. It's very complex. There's whole lineages of tradition. And there is a lot of work in the past 20 years in contemplative science that has shown the outcome of these practices being related to decreased state, stress, increased altruism, or the ability to increase what they call cognitive complexities, which is integrating opposite signals. And that actually has links to developmental psychology work of Kegan that is now the root of the inner development goal. So the set of practices that have emerged out of that are first practices that are individual practices to see how you relate just to yourself. And I've cited a bunch of them here, and partly I wanted to cite which as contemplative traditions that are studied, and there are papers on their physiological effect and their neurophenomenological outcomes. But there's also more, I would say, new methods that have redigested this contemplative tradition into ecologies of practices or into packages that are suited, I would say, for medical schools. And so, for example, John Kabat-Zinn worked at Harvard Medical School to create a program out of mindfulness that now has many papers showing their effects on depression, anxiety, things like that. There's aspects, Jeffrey Martin has worked on the ability to increase well-being through also a set of practices and has done research to look at the best, how to compress that into a smallest possible set of practices that actually provide the outcome. And there's also parts work, which is emerged in psychology in the past 30 years, related to looking at the integration of different parts in you and seeing already the fact that you're a diversity, you're already a social ecosystem within yourself. And obviously all that works at the, let's say, individual level, sub-individual level, like psychological level. And we're interested in this whole level, which is kind of like how you scale these approaches. And that's a whole field that has actually, interestingly, conceptual dependencies or conceptual work in physics for, the sake of my origins. There's a lot of work going on now around defining the fact that selves are actually nested. So there's work from Santa Fe Institute on looking at individuality as a continuous and nested quantity for information theory. There's work in network science now that look at groups of individuals as hypergraph, meaning that actually a group of individuals can have an entity of its own, can become a node of its own, like a group can have its own culture, its own personality. And you can look at contagion phenomena through that lens of group level structures, but it's not just individual and groups, it's all possible sizes and it's participation to many at once. So it's very fuzzy and very linked to the construct in anthropology of individuals that was studied by looking at certain tribes in the Pacific Ocean and looking at the fact that they didn't have the concept of individual, but of intersecting entities that are individuals. So that has led in the past, maybe all that I cite here is really work in the past 20 years of what they call relational mindfulness practices. And particularly they're related to what I could identify as somehow a phenomenology, a direct experience of these higher order individuals. And we call that with my collaborators social somatics, which is this felt sense of the phenomenology of the group. And I put some of them here that I've been able either to partake in or just that are documented, that have books or have even scholarly articles on. And it tends to be either dialogical, which we know as Socratic dialogue, for example, but there's a lot that have emerged related to how do you engage in such dialogue. And actually, John Vervaeke has a big revival of restudying the dialogos, the Socratic dialogue, as an actual embodied practices. And so there's a big revival on Stoicism, for example, these past few years, as well as kinesthetic methods that are more embodied and more in the non-verbal aspects of relating. And I put a paper here from Ricardo Gonçalves, who's studying the practices from the Presencing Institute. So that's kind of, I would say, the état des lieux, state of the art or background around what's emerging in this, I would say, new wisdom landscape. And it's really something that is taking from grassroots aspect, like SLM Recruit Center or intentional communities, to more institutional fabric. So there's the inner development goals, for example, that are trying to weigh aside the SDGs as methods to increase capacities for relating. Harvard is creating an inner-led systems change institute. There's a Mind and Life initiative that's bringing together scientists and contemplatives to actually improve contemplative science on this question. And they actually have a conference on education in June. There's on the cultural ground, there's also cultural narrative shift, and there's a whole birth in the past decade maybe on question of metamodernism, which actually now they have a journal even and institute, and that are related to describing these kind of movements back to the interaction between the self and the collective. And in education, there's also a lot of work, particularly here, obviously, going on around these competencies of social emotional learning, the practices, for example, that the LPI identified, looking at a learning ecosystem in the global south, and the fact that they have a lot of circle methods or certain practices for also improving relating capacities. I put here also a report on microcolleges initiative for whole person learning in the United States that are really, their theory of change is around the meaning crisis. Or there's a new concept like deliberately developmental spaces that are questioning how do you create spaces that not only you are together, but you also have this aspect of developing particular competencies of relating. I put some examples because I did travel a bit at the end of last year of initiatives I found were quite interesting related to this integration. Well, we're in Learning Planet Institute, so I put a learning place in Bhutan, which is a beautiful school where they're integrated. This is the principle, like on the left of the principal desk, the roadmap, goal to ascertain psychological well-being of all members of the school community, area of development, emotional well-being. And so it's a school where they're basically teaching the kids from 6 years old to 16 years old principles of self-curiosity, selfless service, mindfulness. They're having them, be able to describe their emotion. They're doing circles with them, with the parents, with the teachers, and with the staff. And they're trying to make sure that everyone has the ability to have a say and have a talk in those containers And this is Tim, who's actually a graduate from Stanford and decided to devote his life to this initiative in Bhutan. As well as another event that I was in, which is interesting, also showing what's kind of being done in the integration of these inner, maybe mindfulness dimension and outer innovation dimensions with the building of the Gelefu Mindfulness City in Bhutan. And so you have this conference where monks are doing the mandala, reminding you of impermanence, while on the stage you have, mainstreaming mindfulness in early education, mindful leadership and building the future, mindfulness and compassion and a vision for peace and prosperity. So aspects that are really trying to intersect those change makers as well as, I would say, inner peacemakers. And so all that is nice. We have tons of anecdotes. We have good books that are rethinking this aspect of care, I would say, and practices for care. And there's a bit of a theory of change, that these changes of these competencies drive a sense of agency for community action. That's a kind of theory of change. This is something often that is related, but it's a bit always hard to navigate, like, what's the actual research? What's the actual proof that it does lead to something concrete, that it will change things? Obviously here we have the mood who's going to answer that in the next 3 years, but I'm going to show some maybe ways we've navigated trying to think of how we can begin to make constructs and measure some aspects of this particular change that we're interested in. And so something we've focused in the past 2 years, thanks to funding actually from the foundation Bottom, which is a foundation on education that is really centered on this question of relational well-being. They work with an anthropologist, Sarah White, and Sarah White has worked a lot with the Global South. And she was interested in well-being, but she realized that often we come with our idea of well-being, and we go to these other places and we tell them, okay, do you feel well in these dimensions? And it makes no sense for them. It makes no sense in their ecosystem, in the local landscape. So she pushed a construct where you have this meta dimension of material well-being, subjective well-being, and relational well-being. And then we co-design with the stakeholders. What does it mean for them? What is their relational component? Who it is that they need to relate? What is subjective? What is for them a good subjective component? And then once you have co-design, you have a measurement instrument that you can do with, that you can use with the participants. And it's obviously not systematic instruments that you use in sociology, but it's a different type of approach where you're really trying to understand how, at that particular situation in time, in that given perspective, the participants themselves see their aspects of well-being. And it has a relational component, which for us was essential to relate to the group dynamic. And so that's something that we've used recently, actually, in a paper we just published last week, where we did a randomized controlled trial where we had 2 groups of young people between 18 and 25, and they were participating to a challenge-based learning activity where they had, well, it was a pitch that they needed to do on their project. So we had a performance measure, but we could also give them questionnaires on their relational well-being dimension, so their skills of relating. There's also subjective dimension on their self-confidence in the way they navigate their project, or in the way they think that they can impact the environment in that case. And so we compared a group that was based on AI association of diverse personalities, diverse competences, and we compared that to random assignment. It was just to see, okay, does that change the process? Not just the outcome. And so what we found was quite interesting is that we found that there was a bit of a better outcome, but not actually significant when you just look at the final score. But actually, when it comes to aspects of the process of relating, that change of intervention changed the ability of people to get their social capital, basically, so their ability to connect to new people that they keep a relation with, as well as several dimensions of the relational well-being. And this was actually the most significant one. And we also looked at some parameter of this AI tool that was developed, and we found that we can vary that parameter. If we vary that parameter, we can optimize to have better actually experience of your relational well-being, or we can optimize it for having better performance on the project. But these are different things you need. For a better experience, you will have diverse personalities. For performance, you need diverse competencies. And so you see that there's kind of a bit of a middle ground where you have almost these two forces that bring you to different types of outcome you want. But usually we're very focused on this outcome here, and we rarely look at this process-based outcome. So we also wanted to showcase that it can be important to really look at this process. And finally, for the last few minutes, I will show also some pilot we're doing that is more related to implementing such relational practices, where you're really trying to build from scratch this hypergraph of the ability of people to navigate different levels of interaction. So this is a collaboration with practitioner Boaz Feldman, who's actually now doing research work at Harvard, and hopefully will join LPI soon. And this is practices that he developed. So he was, maybe some of you know him, he formerly was a Buddhist monk, and then he turned a group therapist. And what he did in this residency was composing a set of practices from the self, to the dyad, to the group, to the group of groups, what they call community, which is in that case 12 people. And the idea was that, okay, through this type of practices, can people begin to understand, to feel into these different levels, and to feel maybe the way they relate to a dyad is different than a group, and work on their blockages when it comes to these different levels. And we were wondering, how do we measure anything on that? So we did, we wanted to have kind of authentic reports from people. And the way we design is that at the end of practices that he facilitates, in the moment that people are in a very felt sense of where they are in their body, we ask them, they have 5 minutes to write a little report. And they are really in a moment that is contained. So that's how we kind of provide a more authentic approach. And so we found a few interesting things just looking at the descriptive approach, and I will show also a questionnaire answers afterwards. First, we were asking them so they were in this practice for actually 3 weeks, and the idea of these practices is usually it goes through a very strong meeting of a big group blockage, which is the storming phase of the group. And then you have a process to actually do a release where you can have a more acceptance state and altruistic state of people towards the group. And so we first found that there was a little journey of the groups, of the individuals. Here, this is the number of times people have clicked on a certain emotion they had in that particular practice day. And we found first that there was a kind of arc that goes from this positive emotion to very tension-related emotion, into release and acceptance emotion. So it was nice to see first this kind of hero's journey of the group in a relatively short amount of time. We did some textual analysis to look at overrepresented words in terms of when they were used in the program, like early compared to late. And we found, so just looking neutrally at frequency of words, this is a progress in time, basically. And you see in the beginning that, okay, it's embodied, you can feel stuff, and then you have contracted, agitation, tension, intense, you have these very strong words, and finally, relief, calm. So you validate through the text reports what is clicked on the emotion scale, which is a nice way for us to validate this kind of journey. We also asked them about the narrative of, compared to your intention of project, do you feel success or blockage? And so in the beginning, there are things like, okay, they can share their experience, they express, and then there's anger, blockage, so you go through this hard thing to integrate like really strong opinion around, until you have this thing of engaging, authentic, so you have this authentic relating that appears. And we did some work on trying to actually assist ourselves doing qualitative work through AI to actually arrange that in what you do typically is you do keying. You do this textual report and you associate them to a theme, to do thematic analysis. And it was a nice way to kind of condense what I've shown you with the frequency of words by having this thematic evolution where you begin with numbness, disconnection, tension, contraction, and you end with relaxation and ease, emotional release. And you begin on the topic that is covered with what I found quite cute, self-awareness, and you end up at group dynamics. So you kind of have this also shift of looking from self-inquiry to actually group processes. And we did quantify also to the best of our ability. We aggregated answers over 2 scales that we did at pre-post questionnaires about emotional regulation and mental well-being that showed significant change. And this is scale out of 5, so it's not radical. This one is 0.8, which is actually not bad at all. And we have some significant tests as well. Obviously, it's not a longitudinal study like 6 months post, but it's a period, right? So, in summary, what I've shown you here is that for collective intelligence, you need relational coordination. We've studied that with networks, but now we're looking also at the aspect of these competencies to work, to self-organize this relation through increasing relational competencies. And there's practices derived from wisdom tradition, but they can be called wisdom practices in the scientific sense of wisdom, as this recursive relevance realization, to build the sense-making of the collective. It's called metacognition, and we are interested in the way it can impact relational well-being in those communities that facilitate the process of collectives. We showed here some ways to do monitoring of that through a more phenomenological narrative approach. And there's perspective on that where there's some work in the West in terms of microphenomenology, which is ways to access these more direct experiences of people. So Claire Coty-Mangin in Paris is doing some of this work. And also there's work that is quite interesting on not just using words to report states, but also other mediums such as aesthetic cards, like shapes, for example, so that people can relate not just to something discursive, which is something that Ricardo Gonçalves and Arwana Ayashi are working on. Some perspective also is to realize that these practices can easily become performative. And so you can easily have this big buzzword of mindfulness where everybody's like, yeah, you need to be mindful, and that can be really triggering, because so the thing is, when you go to the wisdom tradition, but actually, I would say the sport is really to train on these practices, one has to realize that these practices takes 15 years of study and retreat. And these retreats, you do 18 hours meditation per day. So one needs to realize that this is equivalent to PhD in practice, basically. And sometimes we might, think that it's like yoga. Like yoga can feel like it's very simple, but the old tradition is a very long process. And so I think it's important to also remember that this is, there's depth to that. And finally, and I'm happy François is here, we discussed that also some time ago, wisdom is not just out there elsewhere. There's a lot of people around us that actually have their practices, that have had their way to navigate these competencies. And that can be useful to our local culture that is much less knowledgeable maybe about Manjushri in Tibet and maybe much more knowledgeable about, I don't know, magnétiseur in France. But so there's an aspect that is interesting of like, can we even understand how do people feel about it? How do people have these practices? What is working for them? And can they teach us? Can they teach others around? And how do they do that already? So that's how I want to finish. And as I said, you can go in the slide I shared to go through all the references. And I'm happy to take any questions.
That was awesome. Questions in the room first? Remarks?
It just needs a minute to digest.
Yeah.
You have the slides.
Yeah.
Maybe online?
Not yet. Not parts and graphs.
So, Marc, just one question. When you see in science driven, so in practice, how would you launch a project like this?
Yeah, I feel like so my gut feeling from what I've seen is that there are, how to say, kind of elders or people that are actually, when you want to do citizen science activities, it's good to connect to association, for example, because they're already a ground of grassroots, underground in a way, grassroots deployment of these activities. And the thing is that there is something a bit similar in the, I would say, local wisdom tradition, where there are people already maybe, like association, but more related to whether it's mindfulness initiatives or whether people doing, for example, healing circles or sharing circles. I know some people who do, I know more in the meditation landscape. I know people that do meditation in prison, for example, or for refugees. So I know that they're doing activities there. But I would tend to think, so the question for me is not to go too esoteric, because I know Druids, for example. So there's like a whole thing of our like the local lust. Like Druids was K-12. It was 12 years of training to become a Druid. And there's still people who do that. It's orality-based. And the thing is that it's hard to find them, but once you begin to do retreats, you find the people who can't go elsewhere and they do the retreat center. So it's actually a good place to begin, because those people, they're attracted like magnets to places that are safe space for their practices. So I would basically do a little design of some kind of Discord place where we can already discuss a regular meeting. And I've already met a few people. I've met an ermit engineer who lives in Albi without electricity. And he was a Trappist monk, for example, before. And he knows all the people in the non-violence setting in France. And for me, he was one of the most advanced person I've met in terms of practice. But he lives in a HLM without electricity in Albi. So this is kind of some people I'm thinking of, more on the, I would say, practitioner side. And I think once you create a safe container for people to join, then it can collate more. But maybe you have ideas on that.
I've been reading about Confucius' paths to wisdom, and he says basically there are three paths, according to him. The first one is to go through your experience and reflect on what you heard. So we can ask this to anyone. It doesn't have to be, the world experts on this stuff. The second is more deeper thoughts about something which, was a progressive understanding of something, and says that in fact there is even less people that do this, and maybe even less today because we are, so many bombardments of information that we don't take the time to reflect. But to some extent, there is a variety of people, whether in those practices or maybe in academia or whatever, that take time to be reflective. He said that's the rarest, and he said the easiest is to imitate the wisest people around you. Okay? But he never said how do you identify the wisest people around you. Okay? So clearly there are not those that self-proclaim to be the wisest people. Okay? But one way is maybe to ask people, who do you know? Maybe it's this hermit or this Buddhist monk, or Trappist or whatever. Or maybe it's just my grandmother, okay? Or maybe it's whoever, my little sister. And so if we were to cross those answers, and then you could see those that are nominated, actually, you could, ask what they do.
Yeah.
Maybe, it's, they found their own paths. I met this 12-year-old that wanted to build a new human rights called Eco Esperanza. So when, I heard him talk at in a big conference, and there was an older African that said, "This kid must be 500 years old. He's so wise." That was it was very interesting to see. So I don't think it's only wise elders in the sense that you have to be very careful.
Elders in the soul sense.
Yes. So maybe because you believe whatever.
I think it's great actually because this is the protocol they do for they found out was the most interesting for vaccination early on, which is you ask people who they know, and the thing is that if there's a hub, which is someone that's going to spread contagion, everybody is connected to that hub. So you don't ask people, you don't vaccinate randomly, you ask people randomly, who do you know, and then you vaccinate that person, because if they're influenced, they know everyone. So it's a bit of a similar protocol. Just wanted to say there is two things. First, the inner development goals, they launched a one-question survey on what are these competencies people think are very useful. So which was a bit citizen science because it had some tens of thousands of answers, of free text answers that are now analyzed by volunteer researchers to look at what people nominate as being these competencies. But they didn't ask what you said, which is who do you think has them, which I think, or where do you think you can train for them, which I think is actually could be a very useful type of question. I've not seen that, so I think it's very relevant.
I think one thing that makes much of the work that you present difficult to grasp is that kind of like in Western, like in the Western conception of things, kind of leadership is seen as something very valuable, but like healing is, and you presented this book, Leadership as Healers.
Yeah, by Nicolas.
And like I kind of feel like you're presenting both things here. Could you explicate a little bit more, like the link? I mean, there's like the inner development goals that kind of try to show that, like, oh, actually, it's very practical. Like, if you want to reach any meaningful outcomes in the practical material dimension, like you want to have a successful business, etc., those things are important to it. But I'm kind of wondering if you could explicate a little bit more, like that dimension that complexity that you're moving.
Yeah, I think it's so there's this quality, I would say, of taking ownership for action in a way, irrespective of having received someone telling us you need to do that, right? There's this agency aspect. And so in the theory of change here, the agency is triggered by this altruistic sense in the same form that, same way that if you have, if your body hurts, you're going to take agency to put a bandage to it, right? And so the thing is that if you get into the somatic approach of the social body, which is this social somatics or this way of relating to the group as your own body, like this kind of relational mindfulness approach, if you feel it's wounded, there's no question that you're going to try to actually heal that as a way that the group can self-perform well, in the same way that your body can self-perform well if it's actually has a healthy sense. So there's this sense of talking about community health rather than community structure, in a way. And health in that sense of maybe more Chinese medicine or Eastern medicine, which is flow, ability of plasticity, of feedback. And so it becomes this kind of internalization that any action is leadership, right? Any action is kind of, or can become leadership through this sense of integrated whole. So that's a bit of the argument. But that's agency in a felt sense of agency, which is what often activists have. They have this very urge and felt sense that there is something to heal, right? To fix, often. And so there's a bit of that question of, like, you need ability to hold that, and that's kind of where leadership becomes skills to hold that process. So it's, yeah.
And going back to sort of the citizen science approach, I think if you were to ask people in different groups, what, I mean, they basically double the questions about the healing moment or the healing, or there was a crisis and you solved it. What did you do? Who did what? When did you do it? Where? You basically ask all these double questions, and you could be, having a citizen science suddenly like wisdom using the Confucian questions, but maybe you could ask questions about healing of the collective dynamics. And then, what did you do when there was a conflict, and how did you solve it, and did you feel better, or did you explode? And so you could learn both about healing or about rupture in a way, and you had sort of the crowdsourcing of books, the crisis moment and the resolution moment when they exist. I think that could be very interesting.
Yeah, that's true, and that's true that if you look in the collective intelligence landscape, there are protocols like regulatory circles, resolution circles, that think of conflict resolution that are actually devoted to that tension management. But there is actually a kind of, and the thing with the field of collective intelligence is that it's very practitioner driven. So it's a lot of, I don't know if you can, because you also did studies in that that are more formal. But I feel there's also a whole set of people who have their almost citizen science, they have their kitchen tools.
Yeah.
And they develop things, but it's not so, I would say, there's not so much tracking of all the possibilities, right?
Now it's more about like toolkits, like
It's toolkits, right?
yeah, we just take some way of doing things on other sciences that we apply to your commodity or your problem or what you're facing with, and you model it so that it will give you new results, but there is no theory of that.
Yeah. So, grounded theory.
Yeah, and I feel that there is, I mean, in a way there is lots of Monsieur and Madame Jourdain of these practices, okay. And crowdsourcing their activities, how do they do these things? Is it through humor? Is it through, you bring cake? Is it through, you invite people to take a walk, or whatever. I'm sure we all have to deal with these sorts of things, and I guess some of the people that take the time to formalize it is a subset of the practice and a subset of the people. So I think if you were to ask, maybe there is a community where they don't have a conflict because it never arrives. They don't live this. They've experienced something else, and they would never take the time to document it and share it.
Actually, it's funny because in France, there's a term in communities that is called the PFH, the factor humain, the factor humain, factor humain. And
so how do you crowdsource in this case?
yeah.
We have questions online. Maybe we can, so Maturi asks, can collective wisdom rooted deeply in local culture and practices be interpreted and translated or mapped into global context without losing essence?
Oh, that's such a good question. It's such a good question because, so one of the main difficulties that wisdom traditions face is the problem of translation. And that's why actually, so for example, in the research institutes in Nepal that are connected to wisdom traditions, they spend decades perfecting what is the actual words that can translate accurately a given phenomenology. And those takes really decades of translation. And even if you translate, it's often, the question is how do you recapture the phenomenology of it? So often there's this whole orality approach where you need to have a transmission through someone who, it's a bit like sport, you need to have transmission by someone who holds that. So for me, it requires to rethink orality in the sense that just by text, it's very hard to you can do a good translation, but then you need someone that guides the process afterwards. So I think for me, it's part of this aspect of giving voice to people who kind of are recognized as holding some form of expertise in having a quality of doing this like this.
I have a question on 2 slides after this one. You talked about measuring the impact of participation in open innovation. And I didn't get, maybe it's because I'm not a researcher, but I didn't get what is an optimal fee. What do you?
Oh yeah, sorry, maybe that was, yeah, so there was an algorithm for this AI matchmaking system, and that algorithm was balancing with certain optimal parameters that you could tune. It's balancing between having diverse personalities in the group or having diverse competencies. And what we looked at was for which value would you have the best impact of the algorithm on one of these dimensions compared to the random groups. And so what it showed is that for the solving the project, you want to have more diverse competencies in the group, both for the ability of people to build relational competencies and capital, you want diverse personalities. Right, because actually that's how you're going to get confronted maybe to kind of difference and having to cope with that. So it was to also, yeah, to show that you don't optimize the same thing if you want outcome or if you want process.
Thanks. Sorry.
No, that's very good.
There's another question online from Andrea. She thanks you for the conceptual framework and asks, which scenarios of application do you suggest?
Well, so the right now, at least one idea is there's a lot of work around social emotional learning and about these relational competencies and how it can connect to action. So that's one of the things I've shown in institutionalization. The Harvard's inner systems change framework, for example, or actually here there's going to be a program around experiential learning for change making. And so the terrain in the case would be if you provide this set of relational competencies, are people more able in the education case to actually navigate a community action or their project might be change making action. So the targets for now is really the education, like university education.
Sorry, I want to go back to the P for a minute. So my question is, so it seems in that study that you have to choose.
Yeah.
Okay. My point is the following: if the group was bigger, if the acts competency and acts complementarity, are somewhat independent, in theory, you could optimize both simultaneously if you get a bigger group. At least that's my gut feeling. Is there any data or way of testing this? Typically, if in the mood we have tens of people, but hundreds of thousands or more, can we try to optimize the complementarity on the personality as well as the competency so that we could get the best of both worlds?
Well, that's a good question because I guess indeed it depends on the ability to make group size bigger, even that here you're limited by group size here. You're limited to at least 3 to 4 people in groups. But if you think of larger groups, you could actually probably disentangle the two. But smaller group, it becomes hard to have independence.
Yeah, but even in this, I don't know how many participants you had in this, but you could say, sorry, so what you could say, I take only 50 and I repeat the experiments, and do I have the same p-values? Because that would be a way to test, the impact of the total size of the cohorts when you do the subgroups.
I feel still you're limited by bottleneck is the group size you're making at the end that limits, you have to find, with 3 or 4 people, it's very hard to have the 2 dimensions independence. You will have shaking notes on that.
But if you had millions of people, you could.
You could make bigger, you could make bigger work groups, yes.
No, I'm not talking about the work groups, I'm thinking about a sample. of the total.
Yeah, you could. I see what you mean. I see what you mean. So your question is like, at what size do I begin to be able to have both, right?
Correct.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, at least the way to control for that would be to take this data, to take subsample of 20, 50, 70, 100 and see how this distinction evolve and if it maybe contracts, and from that predict either plateau at some number so that you can make the mood efficient on both aspects. Okay, this is feasible. Yeah, this is feasible. It's like how do you call that? I don't remember the approach.
Like total bird capture, you know, I mean, whatever biodiversity you have or whatever.
Yeah.
Because basically, I'm assuming that there's some independence between competency at the technical level and nice being nice. Okay? So if the two are independent, you could have people that are both competent and nice. Okay? If there is a negative relationship between the two, my assumption may not be right.
Personality here is not nice or not nice, it's traits.
Complementary.
Yes, it's traits of personality.
We're nearing the end of the hour.
No, just one question.
Sure.
Thinking about really practitioners, teachers in school or university, if you actually want to focus on this relational well-being, but you have already so many constraints, like curriculum time, it's the daily life of a teacher. What could be practices, really something easy maybe to implement in your everyday school classes or university classes to actually start this?
So at least what I saw from the Bhutan initiative, and in general also from the learning ecosystem, when you read the report actually that was published here on interviews of the learning ecosystem in the global south, there is a big value in these circle practices that equalize students, teachers, staff, that will have kind of a way for everyone to kind of equalize their voices and share, at least bring skills to share what's going on at the felt sense level for them. And one theory of change that they have there is that this is a trickle down to the community, because you can also do that with the parents, for example, once a year. So it's like circle practices in general, like this that facilitated dialogical, or not dialogical, but practices of sharing are difficult things that are not too complicated to put in place. And here they have a wheel of emotion also for people to be able to do, weather, things like that. So they are, like they are a bit of simple toolkits to already, Like in general, it's the same that is done actually in conference in feminist philosophy, that this thing of lived experience, and to have the ability to hear a lived experience without interruption and without kind of propositional true false judgments. And these spaces already can really, this realization that these containers, this existence of this space creates a different dynamics on the way to relate. And so, like circle practices.
Just two works is the for share exercises. I don't know if you know. It's like a real practice we use in workshop for people to just focus on different kind of languages, so physical talk and like body language, and like emotions you transmit when you speak, and it could be really short, and it could create this container, I guess, for a lesson or for a week or for a European.
It's for share.
So I could tell about it, and we use it often to just open the mind of people we will work with, and it's like an inclusion exercise. So people are ready to work in this mind, like spirits, it really, open the space and put them in a place they are really able to be reflective, to take care of the well-being, relational well-being and stuff. So they could really open up.
Thanks.
Can you come back to the images with the two perspectives? I think at least for a mind like mine, this is very simple. Everyone can understand these sorts of diagrams. And so maybe there is a way, and if it's part of the key components of what you're trying to promote and study, maybe there is a way to crowdsource. You show this image and say, when's the last time that you got that sort of feeling? And for instance, the elephant is just one example. So that's one wisdom tradition, which was actually turned into an experience. I don't know if you were there when the Harvard students were there for the summer school, but all of them, or some of our students, were blindfolded touching that elephant. Okay? And that was after the professor had done it, and it was so fun because it was this biochemist, Romelu, that I love, very fascinating guy, and he touched something and he said, yeah, it's easy, it's a palm tree. Okay? Then he basically, opened his eyes, showed it was an elephant where only the ear was a palm tree, and the guy said, I'm such a biochemist. And for those that don't know biochemistry, the biochemists purify proteins and say, this is life. And so you realize, it was very interesting ability sort of instantly to understand that the detail it took for the reality. And then he has sort of a training that trapped him to do this. And so I think it's interesting to invite people to show a picture like this. And there's many tricks that we know of cognitive science where you can see a semi-image with two different things and say, when's the last time that you've done something like this, maybe in a more social context? Okay, because suddenly you discover someone else's perspective on something that you believe was true, and then you realize that there is different versions of truth, like rational or whatever. There's many things like that people can go through sort of a rational moment.
You said that just before the Russian.
Rashomon is a movie that awards, I think, in Cannes or Oscar or whatever. It's a Japanese story where it's a crime. There is a crime, and you see it from 10 different people in 10 different moments. It's a very old 1950s type of movie, but it's sort of iconic for those that have seen the movie.
Yes. Yeah, it's a good idea to use. Well, I think people would nominate social media quite quickly. But
let's have that as the final word. Thanks very much to Marc. We had a lot of positive feedback online. I saw them on screen.
Yeah.
People were very happy and
Very experimental, greatly appreciate the conversation. I really listened.
Same, so thank you very much.
And by the way, this is a talk. This is true.